Due to some technical difficulties, unfortunately, at Mosheva, it's a little complicated for them to be able to broadcast to us. But I want to thank Dikla Weitzner and all of the staff, all of the tzevet at Camp Mosheva who've made today possible. This is remains an unusual year, as was last year, where I'm unable to be at Mosheva for the safety of all the campers who are in a bubble. And therefore, while you see behind me the outdoor Beit Knesset, which was dedicated in memory of Yaakov, I'm not there, but they are watching and listening to the Shiur. And so I thank Camp Mosheva for this opportunity to once again be able to deliver a Shiur in memory of our beloved son, brother, uncle, grandson, nephew, Yaakov Levi, who this year is 19 years since his tragic accident while he was Rosh Avodah at Camp Mosheva. This year, what I'd like to speak with all of you about is one of the classic questions that we have in Jewish thought. The idea of a balance between bitachon, faith in God, and hishtadlut, the human initiative. It's an idea that was brought to the fore this past year during the pandemic, when there were those who felt very strongly that we needed to have greater faith in God and not rely so strongly on all of the initiatives of science, some of which were still experimental at the time, where others felt that we had an obligation, a Torah obligation, to rely on the doctors, on the experts, and then to have faith as well. The balance of bitachon and hishtadlut is the topic for this year's Yahrzeit lecture. And it is something that is truly significant in our time as we faced this unique challenge itself. It begins actually with a fascinating question that's raised from two psukim. The first is a pasuk in Sefer Shmot, as you see on the screen, source number 1, in Perek Tetvav, pasuk Chavvav. And there in that source, we are taught very simply our obligation. Vayomer im shamoa tishma lekolo Hashem Elokecho v'hayashar be'einav ta'aseh. If you listen to God diligently and you follow his requirements, the requirements of following his laws, ve'azanta l'mitzvotav, v'shamarta et kol chukav, kol ha'machala asher samti al Mitzrayim, all of the illnesses that I placed b'Mitzrayim, lo asim alecha ki ani Hashem rofecha. God states that he is the one who heals us. And therefore, if we listen to God, we will be healed. And yet, just a few psukim later, in Sefer Shmot, once again, in Perek Chaf Aleph, Pasuk Yutet, we learn, Im yakum v'yitalech bachutz al mish'anto v'nika makeh rak shivto yiten v'rapo yirapem. That ultimately, if a person who is injured gets up and he walks on his cane, that person who hit him will go unpunished, except that he has to pay v'rapo yirapem for the fact that he was unable to work and for the cost of his healing. V'rapo yirapem. Is the healing something that's in the hands of God, or is the healing something that's in the hands of mankind? That's the question that we immediately encounter, and that's the question that in source number 2, the Ramban addresses. And he says, V'haklal, the general principle is, Ki biyot Yisrael shlemim, v'hem rabim, that at the time when the Jews are great and they are perfect, they are complete with God, lo yitnaeg inyanam b'teva klal, their behavior is not governed by nature, lo begufam, not in their bodies, lo v'artzam, not regarding their land, lo bichlalam, not in general, lo biyachid, and not specific, ma'am. Ki yivarech Hashem lachmam u'mechmam, God will bless their bread and will bless their water, v'yasir machalam mikirbam, he'll remove all illness from their midst. Ad shelo yitztarchu l'rofem, until the Jews will not need a doctor. They'll not need to be healed, nor will they need it to be healed in the normal manners of medicine. God promises us that when we're complete with him, when we're perfect with him, when we have absolute faith in him, God will take care of us. And there's no need then at that point for doctors. After God has promised us that he's going to bless our bread, our water, and he's going to remove all illnesses. And doctors, their role is really in aspects of our physical health through the food and the things that we drink, to be careful about them or to use them. But yet there is one other way of looking at this. That in essence, people didn't need to seek doctors, but this is what they began to do. If it wasn't for the way people behaved, what would happen was that people would get sick based on the punishment that was due to them from God, and they would be healed through the will of God. But people began to seek medical care, and God ultimately allowed nature to be the way that we viewed, nature be the way that we sought our wellness. As a result, what we see out of the Ramban is actually an answer to the two psukim, how we can address both of them at the same time. One position, Ki ani Hashem rofecha, is simply when we're doing the right thing. When we have absolute faith in God, God will heal us. And yet, when we don't have that absolute faith, ultimately, as the Ramban says, V'zoi kavanatam bo'omram v'rapo yirapeh. And that happens when we don't have absolute faith, then medicine begins to play a role. Or in another way of viewing these sources, we can say that what the Ramban is presenting to us is a dichotomy. That the ideal is that God will take care of all of our physical needs. God will heal us when we need to be healed. And yet there is a concession that God will make. And that is when our faith is not absolute. And when that occurs, then in that situation, v'rapo yirapeh, God gave permission to doctors to intercede, gave us permission to seek healing. Source number 3 codifies this kind of position in an unusual way, because the Shulchan Aruch in Yoreh De'ah writes, Natna Torah Reshut l'rofeh l'rapot. The Torah gave permission to the doctors to heal. Umitzvahi, and it is a mitzvah. Uvichlal pikuach nefeshu, and in fact, it is a life-saving measure. V'immonea atzmo, and if a person doesn't seek out medical care, harei zeh shofech damim, it's as if he is committing an act of murder. In other words, we have an obligation not only to seek medical care, but not seeking medical care is an extraordinary sin. The question, though, in terms of the terminology of the statement of the Shulchan Aruch, is mentioned by the Taz, who writes that not Torah Reshut, the Torah gave us permission. And yet, kasheh, That statement is very difficult to understand. Kevan de bemet mitzvah. If it's a mitzvah that we seek medical care, lama karele tchila reshut. Why does the Shulchan Aruch begin by saying we have permission? Permission and mitzvah are two very different things. One is optional, and the other is obligatory. So why would the Shulchan Aruch begin by saying we have the option of seeking medical care and then saying it's a mitzvah, we have an obligation? Vinirem, dahachiu kavanat inyan zem. This is what it means, says the Taz. The refuah mititi al pi bakashat rachamim. That ultimately, the ultimate form of healing comes through praying to God. The Mishmaya Yeshlo Refuah. From the heavens we have healing. Kemoshe Katav, Machatzti Vani Arpeh. Like God says, that I have wounded and I will heal. Ela she'ein ha'adam zochelekach. But a person doesn't merit that divine intervention. Ela tzarich lasot refuah al pi teva ha'olam. Rather, we need to seek the ways of medicine themselves. And God agreed to have this be the scenario. And He gave us healings through the natural form of medicine. And that's what it means that we have permission. Ideally, God should be taking care of everything, but God gave permission from doctors to be able to use their medical knowledge to heal us. V'kevan shekfar ba'adam lidekach, in the underlying phrase, and since humanity has come to this point, yesh chiyuv al harofeh lasot refuato. It's no longer an option. Once God gave that permission, doctors have the obligation to heal. Ken nearly nachon. This seems to be the appropriate and the correct explanation. Vayem Ramban, and then he refers us back to the Ramban. In other words, according to the Shulchan Aruch and based on the Ramban, in an ideal world, when we had absolute faith, God would handle all of our healing. It was a question of faith. But nowadays, when that's not the case, when we don't deserve it, and nor can we maintain that level of faith, God gave permission, and we have an obligation to seek health, to seek doctors, to try to find a way to intercede on our own. As Rav Soloveitchik writes in his Lonely Man of Faith, the conquest of disease is the sacred duty, and he must not shirk it. The halacha remains steadfast in its loyalty to scientific medicine. It has never ceased to emphasize the duty of the sick person to consult a competent physician. The statement quoted in both the Tur and Karo's Shulchan Aruch, and if he refrains from consulting a physician, it's as if he shed his own blood, which can be traced indirectly to a Talmudic passage, is the cornerstone of halachic thinking. Doctors have the right to heal. We have the obligation to seek healing, but it doesn't sound like it's the ideal. And in fact, Rav Eliyahu Dessler, in his Michtav Me'Eliyahu, which is translated into English as Strive for Truth, develops an interesting thesis. He shares this thesis with the Chazon Ish as well, and his thesis takes the Ramban to a whole new level. Rav Dessler he was born in the late part of the 19th century and lived into the 20th century, passing away in 1953. He lived a fascinating life. His uncle was the great Reb Chaim Ozer Grzinski of Vilna. He was trained in Kelm, in the yeshiva of Kelm, and yet had to join his father while still young in England, becoming the Rosh Yeshiva or the Rosh Kollel in the new yeshiva known as Gateshead in England. And there he was through the Second World War, and only after the Second World War did he move to Israel, where he served as the mashgiach in the famed yeshiva of Ponevezh in Bnei Brak. Rav Dessler writes in his Michtav Me'Eliyahu, the need to invest effort in physical matters as part of the natural order derives from Adam's sin. According to Rav Dessler, when Adam sinned in the Garden of Eden, things changed. And as a result, part of his punishment was to eat bread by the sweat of his brow, meaning that in consequence of his sin, he had sunk to a level of existence that required this. That before the sin of Adam, when he was and Eve was in the Garden of Eden, this idea of having to work was foreign. Only as a result of sin did we introduce what Rav Dessler terms as hishtadlut, our obligation for human initiative to be able to move our existence forward. Previously, he'd been on a high spiritual level, writes Rav Dessler, the level of Gan Eden, in which all needs of his refined body were provided for without any physical effort on his part. The words of the Torah, he placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to guard it, are explained by our rabbis as follows. And yet, when the Torah says that he was given an obligation, la'avdo l'shamro, to guard and to work in the Garden of Eden, the Yalkut Shimoni teaches him that this was totally unnecessary. As it writes, as Rav Dessler quotes, do you think that there was work in the Garden of Eden? Did the soil need breaking up or plowing? Surely trees grow by themselves, or was work needed to irrigate the garden? Surely a river went out to irrigate the garden. Therefore, to work it and to guard it can only mean to work in Torah and keep its commandments. Says Rav Dessler, the ideal existence of humanity was one of Torah and of mitzvot. It was not any obligation of human initiative, of human work, of physical work. Everything was given to them. It follows, writes Rav Dessler, that the whole economic system, which involves us, is so much effort and endeavor in pursuit of our physical needs, is essentially a punishment and a curse. Hishtadlut, according to Rav Dessler, is not the ideal. It's actually the consequence of punishment. And that punishment is severe. And as he continues, but danger lurks on the other side too. A person needs to work only to the minimum level. Hishtadlut should not be the focus. Hishtadlut should only be based on the lack of bitachon, of faith that a person has. If a person is fully faithful with God, completely faithful, as the Ramban had suggested, healing and every other thing that we need comes from God. But because we have failings, we have to make up those failings in bitachon by hishtadlut. And therefore, in the underlined piece, he must minimize worldly endeavor only to the degree which is consistent with his true spiritual level. He must judge the extent of deprivation he'll be able to bear, should his endeavor not be blessed with success for which he had hoped. In other words, a person should only do the minimum. But the minimum is not just the failing in bitachon, that distance between absolute faith and where that person finds himself or herself, but rather that failing, that piece that's still missing, that is specifically the scenario where a person, unfortunately, also, if their prayers are not answered, if God does not provide for them, will they be able to maintain their faith or not? Will they lose faith in God? And if they will lose faith in God, in that scenario, then they need to do even more hishtadlut. There's a very delicate balance that exists. Hishtadlut is necessary to make up for our failings. And our failings may be both prima facie initially, our failings might be later, what happens to us afterwards. And therefore, physical endeavor has no real value. If a person says to himself, if physical value has no real value to it, this is the underline, and I follow this principle in my own life, why do I have to exert myself in the physical endeavor on behalf of my neighbor? But if it's true that everything I need, God could provide for me if I had enough faith, why do I have to give tzedakah? Why do I have to take care of someone else? Why do I have to perform the mitzvot which take care of another? And that, Reb Dessler answers, quoting from a famous Gemara in Bava Batra, and he says that the answer is as follows: that a person has to have as much bitachon as possible, do as little hishtadlut, human initiative, as possible. But when it comes to somebody else, there it's chesed. And so if a poor person comes to me, that poor person, I need to give them tzedakah. I can't tell that poor person, have faith. I have to help them because it's chesed. It's not a question of the balance of bitachon and hishtadlut, of human initiative and faith. There we enter into a new domain. Reb Dessler makes this fascinating argument. He says that human endeavor is not only a concession, as the Ramban says, it's a punishment for our human failings. If we truly believed in God, we would not need to do anything. Everything would come to us from God. Hishtadlut and bitachon. Bitachon is the ideal. Hishtadlut is the necessary evil for a person who can't have enough faith. That is the approach, a famous approach of Reb Dessler, based on the words of the Ramban. And yet, today I want to look at yet another way of understanding this very same debate. And that is what's found in the works of Rav Soloveitchik, in the work, and also in the words of the Rambam. Rav Soloveitchik takes that pasuk, those verses that begin in Sefer Breshit about creation of humanity and their existence in Gan Eden, and turns it upside down, understanding the exact opposite of what Reb Dessler learned. Vayivarech otam Elokim, God blessed them. Vayomer lahem Elokim, and God told humanity, Pru'orvu miluat haaretz v'chivshua, be fruitful and multiply and conquer the land, and master, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, and all living things that crawl on the earth. Said Rav Soloveitchik in his famous Ish Halacha, the lonely man of faith, in that lonely man of faith, as retold in an easier format by Rabbi Bezdin, in his The Man of Faith in the Modern World, he writes, the history of man is a struggle of two atoms. One atom sees his humanity realized in conquering the world in the scientific harnessing of nature to man's service. This creative pursuit lends dignity to man and constitutes his uniqueness in the cosmos. The second atom sees his human distinctiveness expressed in a worshipful relationship with God together with others in the faith community. Rav Soloveitchik explains that there are two atoms described at the beginning of the book of Genesis, of the book of Breshit. There is the atom one in the first chapter. The first chapter of Sefer Breshit, Adam 1, he is the person who is the conqueror. The second chapter of Sefer Breshit presents to us Adam 2. He is the faithful Adam. And as a result of those two atoms, we see, and this is the next paragraph on the page that I have on the screen, on page 4, our modern world is practical minded. It reaches with confidence for distant galaxies, scoring ever accelerating scientific breakthroughs and seeing in the here and now world of the senses the totality of human experience. Practical man lives in a technological world, which is explained mathematically, having victory after victory in his probing pursuits. Modern man is confident, self-centered, and self-loving. Adam 1 is the person who tries to conquer the world, like it says in that pasuk in for the first chapter, Perek Aleph of Sefer Breshit, v'chivshua, we need to conquer the world. That's Adam 1. However, there is also an Adam 2. Moving further down, We intend to define two types of man, or to be more precise, two tendencies of man. Adam 1, whose creation is presented in the first chapter of Genesis, and Adam 2, as portrayed in the second chapter. Adam 1 is technological man, whom we call the man of dignity, while Adam 2 is the man of faith, and they both vie for each other for dominance. There are two sides to humanity. There's the side of the conqueror, and there's the side of the faithful person. The faithful person is the lonely. The conqueror is the one who is confident. And so Rav Soloveitchik explains Adam 1 is interested in not just one aspect of reality and asks only one question. How does the cosmos work? How is what we ask. He's not fascinated by the question, why does the cosmos function at all, nor is he interested in what is the meaning and purpose. His sole motivation is how it works. Adam 1 is the conqueror. Adam 1 wants to be a man, to realize his humanity by being distinguishable from the rest of creation, by becoming the master over his environment. This grants him an honorable status with dignity. Continuing a little further down, Adam 1's creativity is not limited to the mind. He also creates beauty with his heart in the physical and literary arts. He also creates legal systems to govern an orderly society. There can be no dignity in ugliness and political disarray. Adam 1 is the one who makes things happen. He does not, however, Adam the second, like Adam the first, is also intrigued by the cosmos to explain the mysterium magnum of existence. While the cosmos provokes Adam 1 to seek power and control, Adam 2 responds to a different cognitive gesture. He doesn't ask functional questions, which will help him use the forces of nature. He does not ask how or what, but why and who. Adam 2 reacts to the as is, not a mathematical formula, but in every beam of light and blossom. He seeks not the abstract scientific world, but the intimate, qualitative world, not to be the master of nature, but to be in the service of its creator. That's his primary aspiration. There are two Adams, there are two sides, says Rav Soloveitchik, to human beings. There's the creative and there is the faithful. And we need to understand, as Rav Soloveitchik himself writes, the doctrine of faith in God's charity, bitachon, is not to be equated with the folly of the mystical doctrine of quietism. Quietism is this belief. It is actually a 17th century Christian belief that was created by Miguel de Molinas, who says that quietism is calm acceptance. Whatever happens, I accept. I just take it as it comes at me. Bitachon is not that, which in its extreme form exempts man from his duty of attending to his own needs and lets him wait in holy idleness and indifference from God's intervention. We can't stand on the sidelines and just be faithful. Rather, man must use his own skill and try to help himself as much as possible. Then and only then man may find repose and quietude in God and be confident that his effort and action will be crowned with his success. The initiative, says the halakha, belongs to man, the successful realization to God. In other words, whereas Rav Dessler said that the ideal was absolute bitachon, and hishtadlut only came, the initiative only came because we aren't perfectly faithful, or we can't have that perfect faith, Rav Soloveitchik says it's the exact opposite. We have to try as hard as we can. We have to do all that we can. And then once we have done everything possible, at that point, we have to be faithful. We then have to trust in God. We have to view hishtadlut as a first step. Bitachon will come with it. And this is actually based, as Dr. David Schatz has shown, in statements of the Rambam. There are three statements that I bring. The first is a famous one regarding the actions of idolatry. Idolatry, the Rambam talks about, is foolishness. And ultimately, when it comes to idolatry, what the Rambam tries to teach us, as it is underlined, "Aval balei chochma utmimei hadat yadu b'rayot bruyot shekol elu advarim she'asrat Torah enam divrei chochma al tohu vehevel." people who are wise, people who have tmimut hadat. Tmimut hadat is perfect understanding. They understand that all forms of idolatry is just foolishness. And that's why the Torah says, when it comes to idolatry, tamim tiyem Hashem Elokecha, be perfect with God. That we have to live with a perfection not of bitachon, but a perfection that is fully and scientifically grounded in practical living. We have to see what's foolish and what's real. We have to use our intellects to be able to rise above those things that are acts of folly, like Avodah Zarah. And he says the same thing when it comes to astrology. In a famous letter he wrote to the Jews of Marseille, in the last paragraph there, the second paragraph, V'dimu shem chochmat mefuarot v'yesh bem toelet gdola. They thought astrology was wisdom, had great wisdom and great advantage. V'lo nitasku b'lemidat milchama v'lo b'kipush haratzot. And because they were so confident about astrology and just looked to the stars to tell them their future, they never learned how to battle. They never learned how to conquer. Our obligation was to battle and to conquer, to be active, to be the Adam one of Rev Soloveitchik's description. They never did so. And in fact, the Rambam also, in his explanation, his commentary on the Mishnayot, on a famous piece about Chizkiyahu HaMelech, the great Hezekiah, the king, who took the Sefer Refuot, the book of cures, and hid it. The question is, why would he do so? Explains the Rambam on this last line on page 5. I wouldn't really normally deal with this in great depth, except because of the fact that Shamati v'gam pirshuli shlomo chiber sefer refuot. There are those who think that Solomon, King Shlomo, went ahead and he created this book of cures, and that this was a real set of cures, and Chizkiyahu hid it. He hid it because people didn't have enough faith. And the Rambam rejects that approach. And he says this imaginary approach, the problem with the book of cures were that they weren't real cures. We weren't using our scientific methods to understand how to heal people, how to be involved, how to have hishtadlut as we were supposed to. And people in there confused in foolishness, they would say, they're going to say that if a person is hungry and they eat, are they going to say that eating is a lack of faith in God? How can you possibly, the Rambam say, live on faith alone? The mere nature of our physical beings requires us to do things. Adam, even in the Garden of Eden, had to eat. And so the thesis of Rav Dessler is a problematic thesis, because bitachon alone is never enough. There always has to be some level of human intervention. We have to build, we have to create, we have to make a difference in this world. Source number 6 is from the famous Rabbeinu Bechaye. Rabbeinu Bechaye is the commentary on the Chumash that we're familiar with. He lived in the late 13th, mid 14th century. And he has a different understanding of bitachon. He opens up a new approach. And he writes in his Kad HaKemech 2 different pieces. The second I will read with you, and then we'll read what Rav Lichtenstein writes about them. V'od minyana bitachon, a person, another aspect of faith, shimsor adam nafsho el Hashem yitbarach. A person has to give over his life, his soul to God. ותהיה מחשבתו משוטטת תמיד בדבר זה, אילו היו באים להרגו, that a person has to always have that faith, even if they came to kill him. Or שיעבור על התורה, wanted him to stop observing Torah, שהוא מוסר על המיטה ולא יעבור. He is willing to give up his life for Torah. There needs to always be faith. Explains Rav Lichtenstein in the book By His Light, which my wife and I had the privilege of dedicating in memory of Yaakov. It was published right after Yaakov passed away, and so continues to be in memory of Yaakov Levi. Rav Lichtenstein writes, obviously, this approach has a completely different meaning. It does not attempt to scatter the clouds of misfortune, as does the first paragraph, try to raise expectations, or strive to whitewash a dark future. It does not claim that it will work out for the best, either individually or nationally. Having faith doesn't mean everything's going to be good. On the contrary, it expresses a steadfast commitment, even if the outcome will be bad. To be faithful to God doesn't mean that everything will be good, but it means to be faithful even when it's bad. We will remain reliant and connected to God. We'll remain faithful until the end and shall not exchange our trust in God for the dependence on man. This approach does not claim that God will remain at our side. Rather, it asks us to remain at his side. Bitachon is not that God will always protect us. Bitachon means we will always have faith. Naturally, this approach is much less popular than its counterpart. A demand is always less marketable than a promise. For one who makes an honest assessment, though, this approach also functions as a source of solace and strength. It's something that promotes our understanding that we're with God. In truth, this approach presents not just a demand, but also a message. Being disconnected from God constitutes the greatest tragedy that can befall a person. When the Torah states, "Uledavka bo," to him you shall cleave, it simultaneously expresses a demand as well as an opportunity. Ultimately, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from us is that we remain faithful to him. We have faith in him no matter what happens to us. It's not some magical formula that if our faith is absolute, everything will be good, but rather it's a faith that even when things are not good, according to Rav Soloveitchik, we have to do everything we can and then have the faith. And it's a kind of faith that comes for all time. It's a demand versus a promise. Writes Rav Soloveitchik, in Fate and Destiny, part of his Kol Dodi Dofek, he writes, Judaism, with its realistic approach to man and his place in the world, understood that evil cannot be blurred or camouflaged, and that any attempt to downplay the extent of the contradiction and fragmentation to be found in reality, will neither endow man with tranquility nor enable him to grasp the existential mystery. Evil is an undeniable fact. There is evil, there is suffering, there is hellish torments in this world. Evil, which can neither be explained nor comprehended, does exist. Only if man could grasp the world as a whole would he be able to gain a perspective on the essential nature of evil. In other words, Rav Soloveitchik says very clearly that unfortunately, bad things do happen. And bad things are things we can't understand. And then on the next page, on page 7 at the top, he gives his famous mashal of a person who's looking at a beautiful rug, but on the other side. And we're looking at its reverse side. Can such a viewing, the third line, give rise to a sublime aesthetic experience? He said, do you really see what's on the other side, the beauty of the rug, or do you just see the knots and the threads on one side? We, alas, view the world from its reverse side. We are therefore unable to grasp the all-encompassing framework of being. Rav Soloveitchik explains the underlined portion, the motto of the eye of destiny is, against your will you are born, and against your will you die, but you live of your own free will. Hishtadlut, this idea of human initiative, is something that we accept as our role in our lives. To say, I believe and therefore I don't need to do. To say, in the midst of a pandemic, I have faith and therefore everything will turn out right, only is a Jewish approach if we also do everything we can do. Rav Dessler, no question that it depended on the level of your faith. Rav Soloveitchik, no question that it depended on the level of your human intervention and then your faith, that ultimately we will be side by side with HaKadosh Baruch Hu throughout it all. Hishtadlut is creative. Hishtadlut is able to transform fate into destiny. It's how we create the world itself in which we live. There are two different views of how we interact. There is that view of Rav Dessler based upon a Ramban, which ultimately says we put our lives in God's hands. And if we can do it completely, there's nothing more for us to do. And there is the position of the Rambam as articulated by the Reb Soloveitchik, where we go ahead and we say that we take control of our own lives, and then we have the absolute faith. Yaakov Zal, 19 years ago, was taken from us in a tragic accident. And to this very day, we hear from his friends stories of what motivated them. There was a story I just saw that was posted on social media from one of his chanichim, Ari Nussbaum, who talked about how Yaakov encouraged them to come early to davening and how he learned Mishnayot with them. There are stories that I have from his Chaverim. I know Dov Carroll is here online. I know there are others of the Chaverim, and I apologize that I don't have all their names in front of me, where this year, the 20th year of their Machzor, when they were learning together in Yeshivat Har Etzion, all of Yaakov's friends came together from the yeshiva and raised scholarships in honor of their 20th year and in memory of Yaakov. And we were amazed by the generosity of his friends in his memory. Instead of one scholarship, they're already past raising 3 scholarships, and they're on their way to the 4th because people were touched by Yaakov's life. But what made Yaakov's life so profound was the fact that he believed in hishtadlut, in the sense that you have an opportunity to make a difference. And so in the final source, which I share with you, is a brief snippet from Yaakov's essay to Yeshiva University. He was accepted to YU, but he never went. For those of you who know Yaakov, who knew Yaakov, you know the reason he didn't go is because he felt he wanted to stay in Chicago and help his chanichim in Bnei Akiva. He felt he had a job to do in Chicago and didn't go out of town. He didn't go to the University of Chicago where he was accepted. He didn't go to the Yeshiva University where he was accepted. He stayed in the yeshiva where he'd be able to be both learning Torah, Madah, and also part of others' lives. But in his essay, he writes, as the cliche goes, I have got to give it all, my all. Whether it be my studies or my recreation time, I try to give 100%. Why is this so, he wrote? God has given us a certain amount of time on this earth, and we should make the most of it. Life doesn't end after high school. For some reason, people think they can just waste time and they'll make it up later. Well, they can't get that time again. Therefore, I've done my best to take advantage of every moment that I have. Yaakov, when he wrote this 1999, he was 18 years old. He wrote it, and I know he didn't spend a lot of time writing it. And yet this is who he was. And in his almost 21 years on this earth, he proved how Adam 1 can make a difference in this world. He proved how he can change lives in such a short period of time. Lives of friends, lives of chanichim who were his friends, lives of people who got to know him. We continue to hear those stories, and all of those stories are a source of great comfort to the family. But he also left us with the obligation of bitachon, of we staying close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of our obligation to keep his dreams, his hopes, his efforts alive through all of the things that our family has been privileged to do, but more importantly, all of the things that his friends and his chanichim have been privileged to do, the lives they lived and the lives they have created. His was a life of hishtadlut. He was a boteach b'Hashem. He had great faith, and we have great faith as well. He taught us. He taught us that even though evil exists, even though suffering exists, even though he was taken from us so early, and even though we only see the backside of that magnificent tapestry of life that HaKadosh Baruch Hu understands and we can't even begin to grasp, we have to draw closer every day to God. It's our obligation of bitachon. It's not that we surrender ourselves, it's that we find solace in a closeness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, knowing that bitachon is our responsibility, and then the faith will be with us to move us forward. And on that very note, there's one thing that I want to ask everyone to do this year. It's an unusual thing because it's something that just came to the fore in our lives this past week when my wife and I were in Israel. We had the privilege to listen to Leah and Simcha Golden, the parents of Hadar Golden, who was murdered on August 1st, 2014, 7 years ago, and whose body has yet to be returned by Hamas for a Jewish burial. Their family continues to fight for what is right. He was murdered after a U.S. brokered ceasefire was in place, meaning that this is also a responsibility of the United States and our community to do what we can before any other agreements are made. And so we would ask, my wife and I would ask, not only that you remember Yaakov on this, his yahrzeit, 19 years after he died, meaning that he has been gone for so many years. Yaakov would be turning 40 this year. But also, that you take a moment and you do something good. You do that hishtadlut and see, reach out to another family who suffered and is trying to create good by reaching out to the Hadar Golden Foundation. You can email them by connect at hadargoldenfoundation.org, HADARGOLDIN Foundation, FOUNDATION.org, all one word.org. Because what you can do is you can take the lessons of their bitachon, of Yaakov's hishtadlut and the bitachon that we all have, and move it forward to doing some other chesed on behalf of someone else. It's a life of meaning that he taught us. It's a life of purpose he taught us, a life of hishtadlut, and a life that we remain faithful for the gift that God gave us for 20 years and the memories that we will hold on to forever. On behalf of our family, we thank Camp Mosheva for giving us this opportunity to once again remember Yaakov in public. And we thank all of you for joining me today in this Shiur. May the memory of Yaakov Levi, our firstborn son, continue to inspire us and inspire all of you. He was truly a very precious soul, someone who we will miss forever, but someone who will continue to move us forward as well. Thank you very much. May his soul be bound in the bonds of eternal life.